Tartaria and the word Tartarus. That's what we're going to be talking about. This is going to be about mud flood theory stuff. So, just at the top of this, I want to say that I'm not discounting the mud flood theory, but I'm not jumping on the mud flood bandwagon either. Personally, there's interesting things about the theory, but in my opinion, there's just a ton of holes in the theory that don't really add up, where people are trying to stitch together these different things like buildings with big doors, etc., and other aspects of the theory, which I don't think naturally blend together smoothly, in my personal opinion. So I think that it's okay to ask questions about that. So let's talk about the word Tartaria and the word Tartarus or Tartary. The word Tartaria is derived from the Greek word Tartarus, which basically is associated with hell or the lake of hell or whatever. In the mud flood theory, they say that Tartaria existed in Asia, covering over much of what is now called Russia. Since that area of Asia was home to people like the Huns and the Mongols, who were said to raid and conquer people in lightning-fast incursions on horseback with bows and arrows, it is said that this is how Tartaria got its name, because they rode in like demons, etc., as if they were demons from hell or Tartarus, because it must have seemed like hell to them to have all these fast-moving killer people move in and do horrible things to them. So this would place Tartaria somewhere in the 13th century. The problem with that is that the Mongols were nomads. So they're basically moving around everywhere, living in tents. So they didn't really stay in one place. And they were not really known for making buildings. But buildings are a key ingredient in the mud flood theory. So there's a problem there. This also becomes a problem when you know that mud flood theory also states that Tartaria was known for specific forms of architecture, including things like huge doors. But you don't really see the results of that. And even if there were, it'd be hard to ascribe that to a nomadic people. So the things about buildings also are, even if there were some there, they tend to come down. And when buildings come down, especially ancient ones, they tend to leave behind this thing called rubble. Just look at, like, for example, Greek ruins or Roman ruins, and you'll see the broken rocks where an ancient temple used to stand, but it fell down, like, say, pillars that fell apart, etc. And you'll see the rocks everywhere where these things used to be. But there are still designs, etc., on the rocks where you could tell what it used to be part of that structure, right? So at the very least, that would imply that Europe wasn't part of the mud flood. So obviously, from that point alone, you have to assume that it wasn't a worldwide phenomena. But needless to say, let's just assume for right now that there's mud that covered up all these ancient buildings, like huge buildings with big old doors and whatnot. But funny thing about that, though, is a lot of places where people use as evidence for mud flood, where the big doors, etc., were never on the maps. They were never on the maps for Tartaria or whatever, right? So if you're going to live by the maps, then you've got to die by the maps. So you have to show that all these places with big buildings and big doors, that that they are all in the area known as on the maps as Tartaria. And if not, then that evidence doesn't, one or two is wrong. Either the maps are wrong, so that would mean you can't really use the maps as evidence, or the maps are right, meaning then that kind of architecture isn't really quote unquote Tartarian. So you take your pick. And if we're going to ignore the Tartaria maps that you're using as evidence, and then say that all these other places in the world, like the World's Fair, or these other places with big doors that are in other parts of the world, going to say that those are still part of Tartaria, then what you're saying is that these other parts of the world, since they were connected, that they would have been part of Tartaria. So that, what are you saying, like the whole world was Tartaria, or just other places that were outside of the official maps that you're using as evidence for Tartaria? Because if you're going to say that, then you have to explain why, if it was a big secret to cover up Tartaria, then why weren't the other parts of supposedly of Tartaria that weren't in the maps how could they be fooled about there not being a Tartaria if they were Tartaria? That doesn't make sense. That would be kind of like saying that when the Roman Empire got split into East and West, that the East had no idea that the West ever existed, or the West had no idea that the eastern part of the Roman Empire ever existed, or like saying Florida had no idea that Texas was ever part of America. That doesn't really make sense. So quite often in history, people are known by a name that they themselves don't call themselves. For example, Julius Caesar ran into various peoples throughout the world: Scythians, Celts, Germanic tribes, etc. And quite often in those ancient cultures, the people who were the conquerors may have called those peoples something different than what they themselves knew themselves to be. For example, the Apache or some other tribe like that would have presumably thought of themselves as Apache and not quote unquote Indians. So the name you give somebody as a group, historically doesn't always apply to how they thought of themselves, how they identify themselves. So why would anyone call their homeland hell? That doesn't make sense. But I was shown a flag of Tartary. It's a place in Russia that is called that, etc. And they have their own flag and their own seal, etc. But that leads one to presume that if there was a Tartary, that they themselves, the people of quote unquote Tartaria, actually wanted to call their country hell or Tartarus. Same difference, right? So that alone is kind of like, huh? And if you look at the supposed evidence, which is that seal, it has a dragon on it. I guess that kind of makes sense. Hell, dragons, etc. It's just very odd to me that anyone would call themselves hell and then give themselves a seal as a dragon to identify by. Just unique. They also are said to have a yellow flag with a griffin on it, meaning Tartary or Tartaria or whatever. So this makes it important to take into account how long ago the word Tartarus entered the mindset of the Russian people. So let's take a quick look at that. So in the 7th to 6th century BC, before Christ, Greek colonies were established on the Black Sea. You can see it there on the map. I kind of point to it on that one map where that's at. But contact was somewhat limited to trade. So there's not a whole lot of intellectual borrowing going on in that. And also, if the Tartaria was so advanced, why would they be trading with Greeks? It doesn't really make sense to me. Not bashing anyone who's Greek, just saying it was the civilization of the time. So I don't know what they would have that Tartaria wouldn't have. But let's move on. The Byzantine Empire brought about more Greek influence after the civilization and Christianization of Kievan Rus. Rus actually means red. It comes from the Vikings. But the New Testament, which contains the only biblical reference to Tartarus, is 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, which was not translated into Russian until 1816. So that leaves a lot of time in between there. And Russian scholars didn't really begin to study Greek mythology until during the 15th to 18th centuries. This is important to know because the word Tartarus comes from Greek mythology. So, if there was an actual Tartarian civilization, it more than likely existed or began before the time when America was just forming. Probably, during the time of the colonies, before it became a country in 1776. But to be more precise, using the knowledge of the Greek borrowed word Tartarus, and then combining that with those time markers and the maps of the expanding borders of Russia, this would place a supposed Tartaria to approximately somewhere between 1547 to 1689 AD. So that kind of limits when it began and ended, etc.